Yo, what is good, YouTube? It is Who Is Like God, back with another video, and this time I'm talking about a really big abstraction, which is looking at Genesis 22 and comparing it to the ministry of Christ and seeing how the exact same place where God told Abraham to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah would be the same location, the same base where Christ would eventually be crucified as the lamb who was slain. Right, and in the story of Genesis, it actually, says that on the mount of the Lord it will be provided. So after God tests Abraham's faith, it's like this open door is left open as this tradition among the people of Israel, and then we see how Christ directly fulfills that in a lot of interesting ways. So that's what this video is, verses 1 to 3. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So then Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. The things just from this verse alone, just introducing the story, it uses the phrase, your only son, whom you love. And we have to understand, in the time of Christ and beforehand, the Jews, especially the diaspora Jews, used the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation. So in the Greek translation, the word they used is the same word for one and only son in the New Testament, meaning monogenes, one and only son. All right, so it's the same Greek word used in Abraham's story when he's going to sacrifice his only son as the sacrifice that Christ would make in John 3:16. That's number one. And number two is the word used for beloved. When Christ was baptized, the word for beloved in this story corresponds to the Greek word that refers to you're my only son whom you love when Christ was baptized. So I'll put the receipts up that somewhere here. But right from the bat, the Greek words are the same. So these two stories use the same language, and Christ's story is hinting back towards what was happening here. Verse 4, on the third day, Abraham looked up, lifted his eyes, and saw the place from afar. So it's an interesting detail that after the third day, Abraham, the ancient forefather of our faith, so to speak, on the third day is when he saw Mount Moriah, this mountain where he was going to execute his son as a tribute to God. All right, so it's after the third day that he sees this place. In a similar way, it's after the third day that Christ resurrects. So even just before you even get to the meat and potatoes, there's a lot of parallels between Abraham and Christ just on the introductory details of the story and what we know to be historically true with the ministry of Christ and later the resurrection of Christ. All right, so the historicalness of it I'm going to swing back to a little bit later, but here's what I want to focus on now. Mount Moriah would sort of become the base location for where Jerusalem would be conquered. All right, so now you have Jerusalem, then you have the era of the temple, you have the era of the exile. Now for all those years you have the ministry of Christ, and he gets executed in a place called Golgotha, which is place of the skull, which is outside of the city gates. So this mountain would become the capital of the ancient Israelites, and it would be the same place that Christ was crucified. So now I gotta think the same place where Abraham is gonna execute his son is the same place where Christ was executed in his ministry historically. That alone is pretty fascinating. What's more fascinating is that Abraham saw on the third day, and the apostles came to believe legitimately that Christ resurrected after the third day, which is something that they weren't even expecting, because the apostles are blinded to the truth that Christ was going to resurrect. It's not something they expected. It's something that they actually doubted when they first heard it, which is a really embarrassing thing to come from your own sources, right? The leaders of your own movement didn't even believe it at first, what you're trying to proclaim to us. And that sort of corresponds how in the Gospels, Christ was really the only one who was confident about what he had to do. Because when he told the apostles about what was going to happen to him, they were often obscured and didn't understand what Christ was meaning. And it'll tell you that explicitly in a few places. When Christ makes it known his will is going to suffer, Peter tries to rebuke him, and he gets checked by Christ. It's a famous story where he's like, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter. All right, so that goes to show you how hesitant the apostles were to the idea that Christ was going to suffer. But after it happened, and they thought that was the end of the movement, that the Messiah had been crucified, something happened that caused them to make a total 180, that Christ resurrected, that he actually got up. This man got up. And it's from that perspective that they went back to the Old Testament and saw all of these things and started weaving them into the narratives in places like Matthew and other places with the Greek and stuff like that. But the legitimacy of belief preceded any type of use of the Old Testament, which is fascinating because when you just look on like a non-presuppositional level, the same place where Abraham would sacrifice his son is the same place that after the crucifixion, these Israelites, these Hebrew people, would genuinely believe Christ had risen before they ever went back to the Old Testament and saw that this story happened in their own people, in their own history, in the same exact location, hundreds of years beforehand, where it actually says and leaves an open door that someday God is going to provide a sacrifice on the mountain. We're going to come to that verse. He, being Isaac, said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. So this is what I was telling you beforehand. So now they're approaching the mountain. Isaac is like, all right, you have the materials to set up a sacrifice, but where is the animal you're going to sacrifice? Isaac seems to be a little cautious, but he would never think that it was going to be him. And Abraham's response is that God will provide for himself a lamb for the offering. God will provide himself a lamb, which is actually what happens in the story. But it's the way it's written is this sort of like this prophetic statement that God is going to provide a lamb. God himself is going to provide this sacrifice. And this is exactly what happened thousands of years later. Verse 9, when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid in the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." This is the angel of the Lord, messenger of the Lord character. Originally, I was going to go way deep into this at the end of the video, but by this point, y'all have seen some of my stuff about how God's nature is complex, and the angel of the Lord was one of the manifestations of that. The ancient diaspora Hebrews, ancient Hebrews, recognized that God could visibly appear to people in an embodied form from their own records, and it's because of places like this. So when we read this in the Old Testament, it allows us to try to just take what it's saying at face value instead of trying to reinterpret it, because we know the ancient Hebrew audience took this stuff at face value. There's some even stronger cases, like linguistically, where the identity of the angel of the Lord and God himself is intrinsically connected as one. But even just to leave this alone right here, the angels, "I know that you fear God because you're going to sacrifice your son. You didn't withhold your only son from me." So imagine me saying that. I know that you fear God because you did this. And because you did this, I know you appreciate me. Right? That's clearly blending these two identities about this character who's speaking for God and is taking a credit for the commandment that God spoke to Abraham. So obviously, this is the visible embodiment of God's presence that the ancient Hebrews recognized. That's a little bit side trail, because when you get to Christ, Christians, we believe that Christ is this figure revealed to Israel and revealed to the world. So if this is really Christ, that just goes to show how fascinating the story becomes as an extra layer, because that means the one who's commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son is Christ himself appearing to the Hebrew saints before his actual ministry, which is like a mind trip. It's like a paradox. When God the Father would sacrifice his son, the son is actually coming and telling Abraham to sacrifice his son, which is actually looking at the connection between the testaments. All right. So with all that being said, we're actually going to continue on with the prophetic layers of what Abraham is doing here. Verse 13, And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." This becomes really wild when you break it down, because Abraham, as a means of faith, is told to sacrifice his son to the Most High God. But when God sees that his faith is genuine, he stops and has a ram as a legitimate sacrifice, because we know that God doesn't actually approve of human sacrifice. In the same way Abraham was to sacrifice his son, the Father, Heavenly Father, would sacrifice his son for Israel and for all of humanity. We can see this perfectly represented in Acts 10 when it comes to the whole scope of what this meant for the world. The parallel doesn't end there. It's not just that Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, is that he doesn't actually go all the way through with it, right? Again, we know how God feels about sacrificing your family, and like how God is not with that, unlike some of the Canaanite gods and what have you. So what happens is Abraham is about to sacrifice his son. He stops, and God actually provides a legitimate sacrifice. Right, so Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac because Isaac was never meant to be the true sacrifice. This door is left open, and then we see Christ come later as the true sacrifice, as being described in the same way that Isaac was, the begotten, only son, beloved son. And we know that this door is left open because it became a proverb in Israel that on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So now we just got to put all these things together. All right. Christ is described in the same way that Isaac is described linguistically. Abraham sees Mount Moriah on the third day. Abraham is about to sacrifice his son. Then he stops. The true sacrifice is provided. And it becomes a proverb. Third thing, it becomes a proverb in Israel that on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So because of what Abraham did to Isaac, and the whole situation that transpired on this mountain, the Lord will provide. Will provide what? Later on in the same location, we get Jerusalem. We get the temple. Eventually, we get the ministry of Christ. Eventually, we get Christ being rejected by his people, handed over to the Gentiles, and crucified outside of the city walls. So in the same place that the Hebrew scriptures say God will provide a lamb of his own, in the same place, it became a tradition that in this location, God will provide. It's the same exact place where thousands of years later, Christ would be executed outside of the city gates, whose followers would legitimately believe that he rose before they ever went back to the Old Testament and noticed all of these things. And the reason that we know that's true is when you just look at the abundance of internal and external sources from the first century and onwards, but primarily the first century, to see how seriously the first Christians and apostles took this. Right? We can look at the Gospels and see how they're historically reliable. Even if you just want to start off in a general sense, we look at the discourse of scholars about these things, and they accept the general reliability of the synoptics just as a gateway into this conversation. All right. We can look at specific things within the gospel, such as the embarrassing details that I've touched on before that would have been counterproductive to the earliest followers of Christ to have, but speak to their legitimacy. You have those combined with accurate Hebrew names within the locations that they're said to be in, accurate little historical details, undesigned coincidences among the narratives, and just the Hebraic nature of the New Testament, which reflects the culture that it comes from and is said to have come from. All right. So those are things, some internal things that we could look at and just look at how they accumulate. And I'm up for having objective discussions about these things, such as with the undesigned coincidences, not overstating what that means, but from the principles of not being ad hoc and taking that in accumulation with everything else. This can get very technical, but taking a lot of the internal things in the New Testament with the creedal information of 1 Corinthians 15, this is a glance to the earliest believers, because scholars have analyzed that what Paul repeats is something that was in place in the church before he was a member. So what Paul is getting and proceeding out to these churches as an apostle was already established before he converted. So from the earliest days, from the earliest Hebrew believers, they had believed that Christ had died and risen in accordance with the scriptures. So that belief goes back to the very beginning of the movement in Jerusalem. So before they ever went back and wrote about Christ, they had genuinely believed that he had risen in accordance with the scriptures. And to believe that he had risen in accordance with the scriptures, you had to have believed he has risen first, and then see the scriptures as an interpretation as to what that means. All right, so that's two. So we take the internal reliability of what we have in the New Testament. We can trace what the earliest followers believed from the very beginning. And then we can look at both inside and outside of the New Testament, from Roman records and even Jewish records like Josephus, that the early Christians were heavily persecuted. All right, some people who were closest to the movement were persecuted. Now, my point here isn't to prove that Jesus rose, but all of these things show how seriously the earliest Christians, how the apostles themselves took the fact that Jesus resurrected, which they didn't even expect. Now, some of them, such as James in Acts 12, were willing to put their necks on the line for it, as well as James, the brother of Christ, who was stoned, okay, from the Jewish antiquities. So we put all of these things together. We can see what they believed from the beginning. We can see how many members of the community were whacked, who are now in paradise with God, right, but who are whacked for what they believe. We can look all these things to see that before they ever would have written about Jesus or used the or weave the Old Testament into the New Testament, they genuinely believed he had risen. And the reason that's so important is because that shows us that they're not just making up stories to fit the Old Testament. The legitimacy of the resurrection already was in place before they even went to the Old Testament and got their minds blown when they would look at places like Genesis 22, which I'm reading to you here. So the honest belief in the resurrection is the root of all of this. All right, from the earliest apostles, from the 12 apostles and the other people who were attracted to Jesus' ministry, who were followers of Jesus, some named, some unnamed, within that circle. Their honest belief is the root of all of this. And when we know what they believed about Christ, and we can look and cross-reference Christ's ministry to the Old Testament, these Hebraic parameters that I sometimes speak about, such as how he was completely consistent with the law of his people as a prophet of Israel should be, when he looked at as a gateway to check the prophecies written by the prophets and look how Christ fulfilled them in his ministry and in the world on a non-presuppositional level, meaning just looking, not saying Jesus is the Messiah, he fulfilled the prophecies, but Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Let's look at the effect that historical Jesus would have and seeing how that matches what the prophets spoke. That's the angle. When we understand the honest belief as the root, we can allow ourselves to look at all these things and to come to the conclusion that I frame it, how reality itself testifies to the truth of Christ. On this, y'all be blessed in the family. Y'all be blessed in the Most High. Y'all be blessed in the Messiah, who we know and who we can test and put under scrutiny and vindicate from an Old Testament parameter perspective. I want to eventually do a thing on the channel where we can look at the other figures that the Hebrews thought might have been the second power, who they thought might have been this messenger of the Lord, and these other people who the Israelites believed was the Messiah. And when we put them and these figures under the same parameters that Christ is, we see how they never had such an effect or fulfilled the prophecies that Christ fulfilled, both specifically in the time frame he came and was born into, but also the effect he would have on the world, even from the lowest lows, about how the meek shall inherit the earth and caring for them, and the highest highs, royal kings on multiple continents who would firsthand come to believe in the God of Israel because of him. And just looking about how that has connections to Isaiah 49:7 and Isaiah 52:14-15. All right, so eventually I want to talk about actually comparing other messiahs and other figures and seeing how Christ, the identification of this truth of this divine Messiah with Christ, is the only one where we can see these prophecies being fulfilled, and Christ, who upheld the law and who said you should only worship the true God, fulfilling these parameters show that he is legitimate against all of these people who are illegitimate as the Messiah. So with that being said, y'all be blessed, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.